Having finally reached the top 1% on Spades Plus, I want to take this opportunity to reflect on the plays and principles that make a difference at the highest level of play. Like, this is a perfect example of the type of messy hand that often decides games at this level, with particularly their score being so close to the finish line of 250 points. It makes it a classic last hand bidding situation, where the game might very well end in this hand, and a special attention to the score and bidding is required. After I bid 3, opponent bids 4, my partner nils, and after some time of thinking, opponent on the right also bids 4, which at the time I thought was a really smart bid. Because if we look at the score implications, with them reaching 295 if they just make their bid, I'm now in the tricky position of having to both protect my partner's nil, while having to also make my own bid, and in addition collect both of the bags or extra points that you get from winning the 2 tricks that have not been bid on, which is difficult as they have an 8-bit, implying they have stronger cards, which usually gives people more flexibility to make those extra points beyond their regular bid, especially against someone who also has to cover the nil bid. So I do my best here to maximize my points and manage to get 1 out of the 2 necessary bags already, while also making some unintuitive plays that might jeopardize protecting the nil at some point, especially in the diamonds. But here's the situation: if the score is this close, what do you do as my right-hand opponents if this happens? A couple of spades had been played already. All of a sudden, your partner leads the diamond and the niller has played the ace of diamond. And you're out of diamonds. What do? Do you play a spade and make sure you get your own bid? Or do you let it run because with your lead, and if the nil breaks, the game is more or less won anyway, right? So he does let it run. My partner does get the ace point. Now he cuts in, they need all the 3 remaining points. And actually he could have still won it if he hadn't played the spade now and drawn his teammate out of his last spade, and thereby letting me win the last heart now. So we basically both got set, them for 80 points and us for a total of 70 points. And yeah, next hand is not much easier for them. After their nil bid, my partner bids 7, putting Bright Smart into yet another tricky mathematical situation. He can't do more than bid 2. I have pretty much no choice but to try it with a nil bid. End up pulling off one of the objectively worst nil hands that I have ever bid nil with. And yeah, we end up winning the game. One of the key differences I notice is that weaker players often hyper-focus on one aspect at the expense of the bigger picture. You can see that especially often with a nil bid. People hyper-focusing on trying to set the opponent's nil, at a point where it may be much wiser to try to focus on making your own bid, setting the person who is covering the nil, and balance out the score that way. Or in double nil situations like this, where if my opponent had made the endgame math, he would realize that protecting his partner's nil really doesn't help him at all unless he first sets my partner's nil. But if you're asking me how to overcome this hyper-focusing, I could say lofty things like, try to keep your mind flexible based on the new information that every card provides. But while these things may be true, they only really work if you have a foundation of how to get to that bigger picture vantage point. The first thing that you need for a good risk-reward calculation is an awareness of the score and what it implies. And that implies the points itself, as well as the 13 tricks in the hand and the effect of potential 100-point nil bids. In a situation like this, already with the first bidder, you have to start counting the numbers up, like I did at the beginning. Now people might say this is just basic math, but where I can see even people at the intermediate level who are paying attention to those things stumble occasionally is at unusual constellations such as this one. So this is a table bid of 12, and somehow we stumbled into a lucky distribution where we just kind of won a lot of points at the start. To the extent that at this point, without anybody else having won anything, my partner had already gotten 4 above his original bid. And I have talked before about how important it is that once the set is clear, you should try to not win any excess points beyond that. Regardless of this, the situation was here so unusual that it kind of didn't click for me in the moment. And I ended up getting 1 or 2 unnecessary extra bags. And I think the issue was less an inability to make the math, which is that given it's a 12-bit, we would only need 2 points above our team bit in order to set the other team. And by simply adding both bits and achieve tricks of both of us together, I would have arrived at the easy conclusion that we already have 6 out of 5 and thereby only need 1 extra point. I think the issue was more so the time pressure as well as being caught off guard by how much the results deviated from my expected plan. But having reflected about this once, it has already helped me in the next similar situations to react faster to it. Both in terms of having anchor points, how to approach the calculation, as well as importantly recognizing the situations where I need to take a quick pause from my regular play in order to assure myself of those kind of evaluations. Which brings me to level 2 on this point. Having some good heuristics set up to help you have the right calculations ready for each moment. As mentioned in my book review about how not to lose at spades, there's a lot of particularly useful ones about the area of last hand bidding. Starting from the premise that it only matters who wins, while the point difference by which this happens in the last hands is completely irrelevant. In fact, close scores like this, where we only win by 10 points, should often be seen as a mark of skill, and that it's clear that the team that was last to bid didn't put any unnecessary risk into bidding any more than they needed to. If you have a clear lead by the last hand and can decide the game, you generally want to find the lowest possible bid that gets you there without unnecessarily risking to get bagged out. One way to make sure you can't bag out is if you can bring your team bid to 4 above the amount of bags that you have. That works out to make it mathematically impossible to get bagged out. If things are a bit closer, try to find the bid that makes it so that your team can't get bagged out without at the same time setting the other team. So if you're at 7 bags and you're able to bring the total bid up to 11 in the last position, you're making things way more comfortable for yourself. Without overbidding, of course. Also, if the lead is clear in the last hand and you're bidding ahead of your teammate, make sure to bid 1 less than you would usually bid to protect your partner in case he has a nothing hand. If you're behind on score in the last hand and it's hard to catch up with your natural bid, here the philosophy is to try to do anything that can bring your opponents under pressure or force them into bad choices. If there's no other chance to not lose the game, then if you set them, you may as well bring the total bid to 14 in the last round, for example. If you are bidding third, a similar principle applies. If the score is even, given the bidding has been reasonable, you want to bring your team up to 6. And if you're behind by 10 points, you want to bring it to 7, and so on. Like in this example, where they would have otherwise gotten away with a 6 bid, making them harder to set. You want to force them to bid their hand to the maximum in order to win the game, so that it becomes easier to set them. So it also implies having seen the information before you, being able to anticipate the next bids reasonably well. For example, say you're behind by like 20 or 30 points going into the last hand. Knowing that the average bid is between 3 and 4, you should already know that with a below average hand, if they can reach the finish line in this hand, you should feel more inclined to bid a nil than you usually are in this position. This forward thinking also leads me to the final level in this section, which is the ability to make unconventional and tricky plays based on these evaluations. So making the sneaky bluff, underbid in third position to set, fall in this category, or making a highly risky nil, mainly to put the opponent under pressure. As this former number 1 player on the side points out, similar to the risky nil my partner took at the start. Without which my opponents would have been able to make a way more comfortable 7-bid here. Of course, without the foundation of the previous levels, you're more likely to burn yourself than the opponents with that type of play. So yeah, originally I thought my left-hand opponent had issues with the math and that's why he focused too much on the nil. Having looked at the replay, actually he played fine for the most part, and the problem really came in to my third major point, which is an awareness of the distribution. One of the main things that separate the beginner from the expert in this game. One way to get a sense for the distribution really starts with being able to count at least the spade suit and develop an intuitive sense of how many cards are left in all the other suits as well. The next step is to start tracking specific card. That starts at the beginner level with being able to track at least the boss card, the highest card of each suit that is still in play. Combined with, especially in bagging and nil-bit situations, tracking what low cards are left to be played, as well as who is void in what suits. The next level is then to at the same time track the cards, who has played them, and combine that with the awareness of what they have originally bid. Because with that information, you're then able to arrive at an educated guess about how strong each player's cards still are, and thereby where the last strong cards may be located. In an endgame situation such as this, where the combination of left-hand opponent not knowing who is void in hearts, and where the last spades are located, leads to us getting a set that I definitely wouldn't have expected us getting. And a similar situation happened in our original example, only this time it requires even more skill to find the right decision. Because if you count from his perspective all the aces, kings and spades that both me and my left-hand opponent had played together, you would arrive at the conclusion that we both had already played all count cards that fulfill our bid. Meaning me at least playing 3 of my count cards, aces, kings, queens and spades, and him playing all 4 of his count cards. What he needed instead was the situational awareness of who is incentivized to do what kind of bid. While I was in first position, not incentivized to underbid particularly, his teammate with a solid lead in second position would however be incentivized to make a more conservative bid in order to bring the lead home safely, depending on what the other two are bidding. And that's what ended up being the case. He had a natural 5 bid a bit more conservative, and ended up with the second to last spade. That way, right-hand opponent's attempt to flush out my last spade, so I couldn't cut in anymore, ended up having the opposite effect of flushing his partner out of his last spade and letting my jack of heart win the set. I have to say, originally I thought his mistakes were much more clear than they ended up being after I reconstructed the hands in my editor. So yeah, just a quick reminder to not unnecessarily blame your partner if you're not sure about all factors of the situation. With that, I hope you learned something. Like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And see you in the next video.